So I want to talk to you about primarily what the tools are and give you examples of how to use the tools and then what we learn from then using the tools. So if there's any question, like Mike said, put in the chat, we can either do it during or after, I'm fine. So this talk is mainly 4 parts. So the first one, since there are people who are not familiar with these terms and terminologies, so I'll kind of give you a very basic introduction to the point where you can follow on what we have done so far at RHIC, particularly in proton-proton, how we measured these tools, what we learned from that. And then we will go forth sort of the next step, right? Using these tools to then perform differential measurements, and that I'll start with an example, also what we have done at STAR, and then finish towards the end, sort of kind of moving forward where we go from now. So JET, the basic definition is JET is you have a particular algorithm that runs on a group of particles and clusters them together into a single user-defined object. So that's defined as a JET. What this does for you is if you have the appropriate size and you have some appropriate momentum threshold, you collect all of those particles and you can go back to the originating hard scattered parton. So you have a quark coming off your hard scattering, it undergoes fragmentation, radiation, and then finally you have like hadronization. These terms are kind of interchangeable, fragmentation, hadronization, etc. You end up with a bunch of particles, collect them together, you go back to the originating particle. So in that sense, this is essentially a proxy for your hard scattered quark or gluon. Jet-SubStructure is the study of looking at jet-like structures inside your original mother jet, right? So these structures can either be built via some kind of correlation studies or by looking at some kind of algorithms that you apply on these jets. So one example that we will discuss in a little bit of detail is SoftDrop, right? So that utilizes objects close to each other, and you kind of build like this clustering tree that I have in the bottom right there. And it's also funny, this Jet-SubStructure, the fact that you're looking at jet-like objects inside jets kind of gives you the impression of looking at a fractal object, right? So you can kind of look at that tree. It's called a Joshua tree. There's also Joshua National Park near California, kind of northeast, I guess. There you can kind of see this kind of nice branching structures. And that's also is kind of reminiscent of what you see in the kind of simulation of an event there. So our idea is to study what are the structures that leads to the formation of the jet. So the reason why we study this, right? Because if you just look at the drawing that I have on the left here, in reality, you have a parton shower, right? You start with the parton, that showers, and you end up with a whole list of particles. So reality time goes forward. In experiment, we're essentially trying to recreate that, right? So we go backwards in time. We start with the final list of particles, somehow recluster it, and get back to where we started. And the reason why we're doing this, right, is in vacuum, this jet shower, if you just look at QCD, is described by 2 fundamental scales. It's described by sort of a virtuality or an angular scale, or described by momentum or momentum fraction at whatever splitting you define. Right, so you can either look at, like I said before, some kind of physics-motivated observables that are built on these combinations of the particles that are inside the jet, or you can just look at some kind of algorithmic structure of jet finding. Either you're doing reclustering, declustering, whatever. You create these jet-like objects, and you can study kind of 2 fundamental, classes of physics that I like to call. So one is a probe of QCD, as is, by studying the parton shower, the evolution in virtuality. These are particles being created inside your jet, right? So they are in some sense also entangled into, if you have like a decay or if you have a gluonic emission, the objects that arise from there are in a sense entangled, and that is also a study of QCD. There's also the secondary part where we have Monte-Carlo models that seem to predict the data that we have at the LHC, but there's also data at RHIC and coming forward at the EIC. So there's a variety of scales. So whatever Monte Carlo you have, you want to be some kind of, you want it to have some kind of universality there, where you can tune it, assuming you have the correct parameterization of the model. An appropriate universal tuning really helps in your measurement and in your understanding. So that being sort of the baseline, let's move on to looking at what kind of measurements. So jets at RHIC. So if you're coming from the LHC, which I know a lot of us are not, I like to show this slide. When we compare it to the LHC, the spectra at RHIC is very steeper, right? So we kind of have access to roughly 10 to 60 GeV jets if you're for a center of mass energy of 200 GeV. But given that, for example, ALICE can also measure jets in this, kind of the upper end of the spectrum, maybe 40, 60 GeV, they do that pretty often. When you compare these two, we have to keep in mind that the relative quark-gluon fractions are very different, at least in proton-proton, and we go to heavy ion, that's a whole other picture that I'll very briefly talk about that at the very end. But this kind of leads to, very interesting comparisons at similar kinematics. Also, when you look at the LHC, which is sort of the far future, the EIC, which is the far future of our field. So first observable I want to talk about is the jet mass. So I said that evolution in vacuum is sensitive to the virtuality scale and the momentum scale. So the mass is essentially proportional to the virtuality. It's a broader class, it's part of a broader class of observables that are known as angularities. They are essentially, like I said, sensitive to the dynamics of the shower, and fixing the mass or the virtuality tells you essentially what is the spread of energy in your jet. So it governs what kind of jets you're looking at. So once you identify mass and PT, you're now looking in a differential fashion. So there's also this soft drop algorithm, which is essentially a grooming algorithm. So this is relatively standard in our field right now. Like a lot of people and a lot of experiments are now measuring this. What it does is it basically removes soft wide angle contribution inside your jet. And theoretically, what that gives you is an advantage by removing these non-perturbative contributions. I know there are some incoming first year students here, so this is a little bit of a fancy word. But what this does is relatively, simply is it cleans the grass in your jet. So you have the hard parton, the hard scattering coming from your parton. The rest of the stuff is kind of grass. The grooming ideally tries to remove the grass. So when you do a calculation on a piece of paper, you can kind of get back to the hard part. So what grooming tells you is it gives you three observables. It gives you the groomed jet. Once you remove the grass, you have the mass of that jet. You can also look at the RG, which is now the opening angle of the prongs that survive. So you have a two-prong structure. The hardest prong that passes this particular criteria that we have there, the Z-cut 0.1, and the momentum fraction at that particular split. So let's start by looking at just the mass. So this is a recent measurement. The paper is now ongoing. Should be out, probably at the end of the year or maybe the start of fall. Wait, that's really soon. Maybe a couple months. Yeah. So on the left we have lower PT, so 20 to 30 GeV. On the right we have higher PT, so 30 to 45 GeV. The red star markers is the groom mass. The blue star markers is the regular jet mass, and they compared for the same PT of jets. And you can kind of see the uncertainty in the bottom panel of the groom mass. So just comparing the blue distribution to the red distribution, you can kind of see that you're losing mass. So you're removing the grass, that reduces the mass. And as you go to higher PT, you compare to the dotted curve, that's Pythia at the parton level, so no hadronization, right? And you can see the groom mass gets closer. It's not exactly the same. There's still a shift in the distribution, but it gets closer, right? And grooming, this is why grooming is kind of useful, right? Because you've removed these non-perturbative effects that are not necessarily calculable. You have to put some kind of model, some kind of assumption. But that's why we want to measure the groomed observables here. So this is now the groomed jet mass for the same PT bins that I showed before and compared to the Monte-Carlo. So now this is the second part of the physics, right? We want to compare how the Monte-Carlo is able to reproduce our data. So if you look at the three different colors, right, the color scheme will be the same throughout the talk. So the blue is Pythia 6, that's tuned to star data, right? The two other colors, the black one is Pythia 8, tuned at the LHC, and the magenta is Herwig, tuned at the LHC. So just by looking at the ratio panel, you can see that the Pythia 6, the blue curve, describes the data relatively well, and that's, within the uncertainties, it's actually quite a remarkable agreement. The Herwig and the Pythia 8 essentially give you what I like to call, I borrowed this term from Ben Nachman, is from Alice, is from Atlas, is a Pythia data Herwig sandwich, right? So you can kind of see this, crisscross behavior, and this has been shown for a lot of substructure observables at the LHC, at RHIC as well. So we know there's this difference between the two Monte-Carlo, right? We know there's a tune difference. So is it just the case that these are, you have differences in the shower, you have differences because these are groomed, right? So essentially you've removed some kind of non-perturbative contribution. So then now the question is, what is the difference between, can we have a scale that points to the difference between the two? So mass is at being an angularity is sensitive to z times theta squared. So you already have two scales in there. So now let's separate it out. So that's where the ZG observable comes in. So this is the momentum fraction at your first hard split. And there you can see this is now a paper that's been out on arXiv for a while, for a few months, and it should be published soon. The plot shows you different PT bin. So on the left, you have low PT, right, you have high PT. You see the data in the red star markers, and as you increase the PT, the distribution kind of goes up, right? It's already a little bit steep to start with, but then it gets even steeper. And at that, kind of 25 GeV onwards, that's what we like to call the universal 1/z behavior, right? And the comparison to Monte-Carlo is the same, right? You see Pythia 6, but now Pythia 8 also described the data, and Herwig essentially deviates. So Herwig tells you that you have kind of a harder split at the higher z. It's kind of, the ratio is above 1 there. So that's very interesting, first of all. So there have been some Alice measurements. I did a very quick and dirty, PowerPoint comparison of the two figures. I show similar PT bins, but one thing to note is that Alice are charged jets, but they also have different, very, very different Quark-Gluon fractions, right? So for example, you see the plot from the Alice paper, that's 7 TeV proton-proton collisions, 40, 60 GeV jets. You kind of see that they kind of lie on top of each other. And then on the left, you have 13 TeV jets, 13 TeV collision from Alice PP, but you have 15 to 30 GeV jets. So I kind of put this roughly in that 20 GeV bin. And you see the binning is quite different, but they are roughly the same. There's some differences here and there, but relatively at the high PT, you kind of see this universality of this 1/z shape. So I thought that's kind of cool. There's also the other scale, which is the RG, or the opening angle, right? So the RG essentially reflects the momentum-dependent narrowing of jet-SubStructure, like what we're seeing in the figure, right? You see at low PT, the distribution peaked at larger values. To go to high PT, the distribution shifts, right? So as you increase the jet momentum, the shape of the jet generally narrows, right? The harder part of the jet essentially narrows. And if you go to the LHC, you look at 200, 300 GeV jets. This RG is basically all there's a very, very small, shallow tail there. But now, right, compared to the data, so Pythia 6 and Herwig, Herwig gets relatively close, but Pythia 8 now significantly different from the data. You can see in the medium PT bin, so like 20 to 40 GeV has a secondary bump that's not there in the data, right? So now we have an observable, the mass, that showed the differences. We split it up into its corresponding scales, the Z and the theta, and we saw where the differences in the Monte-Carlo show up. We also compared this, going back to the idea of studying QCD, having a calculation at these different scales. We compared this to kind of very recent theoretical calculations at next to leading log. So this was done by Kyle Lee, who's just defended his PhD at Stony Brook. Now he's going to Berkeley, and his collaborators. You see the data again in the red star markers. So the top row is low PT, so 15 to 20 GeV. Bottom row is factor of 2 increase in the PT, so 30 to 40. The left column for each of these figures is kind of narrow jet, so 0.2 in terms of jet finding. And then the right column is wide angle finding jet. So these are 0.6 jet. So you collect all of the softer radiation. So you kind of see the regions where the calculation from QCD breaks down, right? So if you go to higher jet radius, higher PT, you can kind of describe both the Z and the RG, right? The distributions are, well, a little bit different, but this is an incredible, comparison, knowing that you don't have any non-perturbative corrections in the theory here. But as you go to lower radius, lower PT, you have significant breakdown of your comparison between the data and your theory. The data is not following this 1/Z shape anymore. It's like flat at the lower jet radius. So we also extended this kind of program of studying the Jet-SubStructure to proton-gold collision. So here's a result by a grad student at Wayne, Isaac. He's actually pointing to this to this figure. He showed it recently, where the PP data for the jet mass is what I showed you in the previous slides. So that's in the black. Sorry, the red one is now proton-gold collisions that are selected based on high event activity. So the event activity is forward going in the gold direction. So the high activity there, we want to look at what happens to jets in the mid rapidity. So this is something that Dave and Tong kind of have been pioneering, Dave particularly in his studies. So you can kind of see that at the PT that we're looking at, 20 to 30 GeV, for both mass on the left, groom mass on the right, there's really no difference between the PP data and the P-gold data. So whatever suppression or enhancements you can see in the spectra are not due to modifications of the Jet-SubStructure, right? So this actually points us to something in terms of, okay, maybe there's selection bias, et cetera, and that something that Dave can really expand in a lot of detail. So that brings me to sort of conclusion of the first part of the talk. I want to kind of emphasize that jets at RHIC energies is an exciting place to study fundamental QCD. Soft drop observables, they are quite sensitive. You saw the differences in the different Monte-Carlo. Another thing, I will talk about subjets in the next step, but there's a need when we go to heavy ion collisions, there's a need for a certain robustness, and we'll get to that. So you kind of start to see this breakdown of this kind of splitting behavior as you go to very small or lower PT. And as you go to Jet-SubStructure and cold nuclear matter effects in proton gold, that kind of points to more differential studies, varying in event activity, rapidity, gold going, proton going, Bure-Connex selection, et cetera. So that's all can be done in the future. So now we go to kind of concrete example of where this becomes useful in the case of heavy ion collisions. So this is something I took from the nuclear physics long-range plan. So this is, it's been shown in a lot of talks. If you've seen my talks for the last couple of years, you have definitely seen this figure. I really like it because it tells you that as you have a higher temperature, your jet kind of starts. It's looking at different resolution scale, and as it evolves along, it's seeing different resolution scales in the medium. So jets are primarily multi-scale probes of the medium, and that can lead to studying the microscopic properties. And this is something that I took directly out of the long-range plan, right? This is structure at varying scales. But one thing to note here is that this is inherently a two-step process, right? And they are not mutually exclusive, right? So you have to understand how jets lose energy, how jets are, and then how they lose energy, and then what kind of jets lose energy, and then you can work towards extracting the medium properties. So that's what we have done in our work. So this one kind of tells you what, the problem that we are essentially dealing with, right? So you have a concurrent evolution of the jet and the QGP. And for those who are, not essentially familiar with kind of the new students here, is that the heavy ion collision, the moment it happens, it produces this dynamic emergent state of matter, the Quark-Gluon Plasma. That's what we're trying to study. Jets are created instantaneously in this process. They're essentially coming right off the hot scattering. Jets and the QGP evolve simultaneously. This interaction results in parton energy loss. So think of it as someone running underwater versus someone running on land. Underwater, you're essentially quenched in this case. right? So jets lose energy in the medium, and the resulting, any observable that you see. So you have a jet, you do a measurement in gold-gold, you do a measurement in proton-proton, you make a comparison. Any modification that you see, we have been using it as a clue to the properties of the medium. So this is where I think the need for substructure actually comes in, right? So again, I like that figure a lot. So it's there here again, because whenever you study jet quenching, right, we always look at it as a function of PT or some kind of observable, delta phi correlation, right? But that's only one kind of, you're essentially integrating over jet topology. So we know that jet evolution in vacuum, right, is essentially in these multiple scales for a given PT, you have a variety of structure. It was a distribution. You look at this RG, the Z, they are distributions, right? So what I really want to do is essentially have this kind of knobs for my analysis where I say, okay, this jet had a particular topology, had a particular opening angle, had a particular splitting, had a mass. I want to know how that class of jets essentially got quenched. And this angle essentially of your jet in the presence of the medium transforms to a resolution scale. That's where this figure comes in, where you have a jet that has a certain scale. It can then probe the medium at its corresponding scale. So I want to spend a minute or so on this, because this is a phase space that's going to be important in this talk. So say you have a quark, it radiates a gluon at a certain, the gluon has an energy omega at the opening angle theta. So now I can plot the phase space of the formation time of that split and the energy of that particular omega. So if I just look at the spectra jets, up to 60 GeV, I put a Z cut of 0.1, right? RHIC essentially, looks at the low end of the spectrum, right, of this phase space. The LHC measurements go to kind of the higher end of it. I mean, these are not hard boundaries. They're, of course, variations. If you plot vacuum emissions here, just from QCD, right, the vacuum formation time, is proportional to 1 over theta squared times omega, right? So theta is this like opening angle, and as you vary theta, you get the different black lines that you see in the figure there. So if you have very narrow emission, that happens kind of later in time, right? You have very wide angle emissions, that happens earlier in time of the kind of emission, right? Now, if you look at medium-induced radiation, right, there is this parameter Q hat that's essentially telling you how much, energy you've lost as you travel in a kind of distance through the plasma. So for different values of Q hat, you can have different medium-induced radiation. So if you just assume that the medium-induced radiation is proportional to the energy, but inversely proportional to the Q hat to the power 1/2, you kind of get these red curves for different values of Q hat, right? So you can already see there are regions of this where you can have vacuum-like emissions, there are regions where you can have medium-like emissions, and there are regions where you can have both, right? And if we can translate this theta into an experimental observable, what we have is then we can separate two classes of jets. So class of jets where you had very early kind of emission, right? This kind of antenna-like picture then goes through the medium. And depending on your medium's resolution length or the coherence length, that can then look at the jet as one object or two objects, right? If you have a very late emission, right, that happens, like I said, it happens later in time, it's relatively narrower, then any energy loss that you see is essentially coming off this, color charge is going through the medium. So now the goal for us is to translate this theta into an experimental observable. So before we talk about what observable, let's talk about what we actually need from this observable, right? So we want this observable to be sensitive to jet physics. I mean, that's kind of the default here. But importantly, we want it to be insensitive to the underlying event of the gold-gold collision. So I have here a correlation plot, right? The x-axis is the proton-proton jet, and then the y-axis is basically I take the same jet, I embed it in a gold-gold underlying event. You see these red arrows there, and then you compare the correlation. Okay, what is the observable in PP? What is the effect on the observable in gold-gold? So if you just take your soft drop, RG, that I showed you earlier we made the measurement, right? You see this kind of diagonal structure, but then you also see this huge, off diagonal element, right? And now that essentially tells you that, okay, if I select in gold, I select the value of my RG, I cannot know for sure if this came from the jet itself or it came from this background, right? But the key point here, right, is the Z cut is 0.1. So at least people have actually made this measurement, James and others, by looking at, can we crank up the Z cut to kind of make this a little bit more diagonal, right? So we also looked at it. It's a nice idea. So if you increase the Z cut, right? So here Z cut is now 0.2. And just a reminder, Z cut is a momentum fraction cut of the split, right? So it's actually, you groom it, you look at the object remaining, that PT compared to the prong that, that has the split here. So Z cut 0.2, you see this off diagonal thing kind of disappear, but it's still there. You can't unfold this right now at star energies. So Z cut of 0.3, okay? I mean, you kind of recover diagonal structure. This could be unfoldable, right? You can remove detector effects. Again, no, why not stop there? Let's go crazy, right? Z cut of 0.4. So extremely, extreme cuts on the jet, and you can see, okay, well, I mean, you have a very nice diagonal. But now the question is, what is the survivor bias in this sample? I actually don't know. I have been looking at this. There are some indications that you might be selecting wider splits, etc. But the question is, can we have an observable where we're actually cutting on the PT, the absolute PT, and not a fractional PT? Because the medium scale, exists in an absolute PT. You drop a circle in a heavy ion underlying event, you get an actual momentum coming from just the background, right? So this is where I think subjects, really come to the rescue. The way we define these subjects is you have your jet, you drop all the constituents, you recluster with the same anti-KT algorithm, but smaller radius. So I now chosen 0.1 in this kind of drawing, right? And you get your leading and the subleading. So the leading is now the red, subleading is the blue. So then what you do is define two observables. The momentum fraction, Z subjet, is basically the softer subjet inside your jet divided by the sum of the softer and the leading subjects, right? The subleading and the leading. And then theta is basically the opening angle between the two. So first thing you can tell that this observable is going to be dependent on the size of the subject, right? And that's what I'm showing in the figure there. So this is just out of Pythia, kind of lower PT jets. The Z subjet distribution is in the left, the theta is on the right, and each of those lines correspond to a different subjet radius. So you can remember what the ZG distribution looked like, right? I made a point of pointing to this 1 over Z kind of behavior. And this subjet Z is not the same observable, right? You can already see you need to go to a large subjet radius in order to recover this kind of 1 over Z picture. The smaller your subjet radius, the more inside the jet you are, the more inside the core of the jet that you're essentially looking at. So your leading and the subleading, smaller the radius, they end up sharing a lot of the energy. They're essentially the core of the jet. You can see in the magenta, smaller radius, Z subjet is peaked at 0.5. Same thing for now the opening angle, right? So as you vary as you increase the subjet radius, there's a natural cutoff on the radius. You can't go smaller than that, but you get a kind of distribution. So this is what we measured in PP collisions, fully unfolded compared to Monte-Carlo, and this will come out in a paper relatively soon. So you can look at the Z subjet distribution at the top row for 15-20 GeV on the left, 30-40 GeV on the right. And then we compare it to the theta subjet observable kind of in the bottom, right? Again, for the same PT bits. The data, as usual, is in the red star markers. The Monte-Carlo is in different colored lines. So you kind of see this shape of the shape of the Z subjet changing as you increase the PT, right? So very low PT, the shape of the jet itself is broad. We saw the RG being wide, right? So Z subjects, the subjects are sharing the momentum inside your jet. As you go to higher PT, your jets get narrower, one of the subjects basically captures the core, and then the other one is now to the little bit to the edge. That's why the Z subject goes back, peaking a little bit at 0.1, 0.15, something like that. But kind of the curious thing here, right? You look at the theta subject. We saw big differences in the RG when you compare, the different Monte-Carlo. Right? You saw Herwig looking a little bit similar to data, but then the RG in Pythia 8 was a little bit, larger values. But here, you kind of see it all lie on top of each other. So now you have an observable that is sensitive to the jet kinematics, right? But it is also a little bit insensitive to the description of the shower in the Monte-Carlo. I mean, they kind of give you the shapes, similar shapes. So now the question is this also sensitive to the underlying event? And you do the same correlation study, and you see that, hey, this is actually quite robust. But in order to get it robust, you had to do, I show there, a 3 GeV cut on the subjet PT. But this is fine, because this is now a cut on the medium scale. There is a fair question. What does the survival bias of this kind of subject look like? And I can tell you that if you increase your Z cut, right, the fractional cut that you're applying, at least for these kinematics, increasing Z cut from 0.1 to 0.2, you lose roughly 50% of your jets that kind of failed that particular threshold. But if you increase the subjet PT of up to 3 GeV from nothing, you're only dropping around 15 to 20% in this case. So there is a kind of sculpting going on in your survivor population, but it is reduced. And also the fact that we can cut on an absolute PT scale, and this can help in terms of calculations to understand, okay, there's an actual subject scale where I can start my integration from. So this subject theta is now the observable on my norm. So I think people here, most of them have kind of seen this first, talked about Kolya, myself, the way we define subjects at start. So we start with this kind of full event. We apply a hard constituent cut, 2 GeV, again, in like absolute PT. And anything that's surviving, right? You run your jets on that. Any jets you get are basically free of combinatorial background. So these are purely coming from the hard scattering, but there's a significant bias in the jet fragmentation because you applied this 2 GeV cut. And now the point is, okay, let's use that to our advantage, actually. So we know we have hard fragmenting jets. So maybe they undergo less energy loss, but we will see they actually do undergo energy loss, and we can actually quantify that. So we also do a dijet selection. So we have a trigger jet, right? And then we look at back-to-back in delta phi. We take the recoil jet. There's an asymmetric PT cut. So the trigger is 16 GeV and above. Recoil is then 8 GeV and above. And then we can make the dijet asymmetry for these observables. So the solid markers is in goal data. The open markers is our reference. So PP data embedded in goal minimum bias collisions. So for these hardcore jets, jets that have very, 2 GeV and above constituents, you can see significant imbalance in the goal compared to the PP. The filled markers are, quite different than the open markers. So this tells us that jets made of 2 GeV and above particles, there is imbalance, there is energy loss. The question is, where is this quenched energy, right? And this was shown in our kind of landmark PRL paper a few years ago, where if you now go to the softer constituents, you recover this lost energy, right? So the right-hand side plot is basically made from dijets where they are the same that you found in these kind of hard constituent jets, but you basically drop the threshold. You go down and include particles down to 200 MeV. So you have included the soft contribution. And then you look at the dijet asymmetry, the filled markers and the open markers are sitting on top of each other, right? So this tells you that any energy you lost from the high PT particle, you recover it in the lower PT particle. So now we can say, okay, here's my observable that I can look at Jet-SubStructure. I can tag jets that have a corresponding value in Z and theta. So the Z is shown on the left, the theta is shown on the right, and these are primarily for the recoil jets. And you can see you look at the theta distribution, they kind of have this falling behavior. The goal data and the PP reference pretty much look similar, right? And this actually tells you that, okay, the jet quenching for these jets, which we know are quenched, they don't actually show up as a difference in our substructure observable. So then we say, now I have two classes. The blue is basically narrow jets, so theta between 0.1, 0.2, and then now my red is now wide angle jets, so 0.2 to 0.3. So this is now a differential measurement in an absolute resolution scale. This is not a measurement in like mass, which includes the both, or KT, which is roughly similar, it also includes both of those scales. So now we have the dijet asymmetry for the hardcore jets. Again, in the black is what we saw earlier. The bottom two, the blue is now our narrow jets. The red is now our wide jets. So because these are relatively older data, so this is 2007 data from STAR, the angular resolution that we have 0.1 to 0.2 is a little bit large, right? When we go to the highest statistics data set that we currently have, we can actually make that smaller by a factor of 2 or even 3. But looking at what we currently have now, you see the blue jets and the red jets, they basically have similar kind of behavior. They are still imbalanced. The solid markers are significantly different than the open markers. And now if you include the softer particles, you see that you're still recovering the lost energy for both classes, with these 0.1 and 0.3. And this is actually quite, this is quite interesting. We can then put these together in that phase space that we saw a little bit earlier, right? So the blue, again, is the narrow ones, the red is the wide ones. Based on where the Z subject is, the mean is roughly 0.3. We kind of integrate over Z, right? So I kind of drew a little bit like, kind of rough phase space of where these jets lie in our splitting phase space. So let's look at what we know. The splittings are PP-like, right? The substructure observables, the subjet observables look the same for gold, and PP reference. And we know we have a trigger bias here, right? And we have a dijet selection. So at RHIC energies, that results in a kind of surface bias, right? So the path length for the recoil part is relatively small. It's on the order of 1 or 2 Fermi, right? It's a little bit, a couple of Fermi. So what we can kind of infer from that is that the first split, likely happened outside the medium, and any resulting modification that you see is a single color charge going through the medium, radiating energy via soft gluon emissions, a la the LPM effect, and then splitting once it's outside the medium. So this is sort of the key, takeaway by using substructure as a tagging tool for your jets and differentially studying energy loss. So this is what we'll put in our paper. We are working on comparison to different Monte-Carlo models, see if we can kind of recreate this kind of picture. So the next steps, kind of moving forward, because we're not done yet, right? I mean, we only identified energy loss from a single color charge. We have to take that to the next step. So we know there is a bias. So now let's start working backwards, right? Let's selectively reduce the bias and then kind of increase the medium interaction. So I kind of have this kind of scale there, where if you ask for which jets are more quenched, right? The jets that kind of have this dijet selection are less quenched compared to those that are kind of semi-inclusive. You only have a trigger, and then you look at all the recoil that's kind of back to it, right? So this is kind of study that Dan is working on, and his measurements kind of fall to the right side of that category. So I mean, this is now the program, right? You start from a bias selection, and you gradually move to kind of an unbiased selection. And as you move, you're scanning across the phase space of these emissions, where you can then do differential in these substructure observables, and you can study the extent of the energy loss that you have. And this is what we like to call as jet geometry engineering, work done by a former PhD student who's now machine learning scientist at Ford across the city here. And as we scan across this kind of phase diagram, right, you can go into regions where you have, gluon emissions, and also you have medium-induced radiations that can affect your substructure. So that's kind of the goal of this program. So, quickly summarizing that, right, the differential studies, momentum and like angular scales are a key aspect of probing the QGP in its microscopic scales. Biases are good as long as we understand them, and then we move forward to an unbiased spectrum. This recovery of like energy that you lost at RHIC energies, if you have this kind of dye-jet selection, you're recovering all of these in softer particles. In the inclusive case, you're still not recovering, right? In the semi-inclusive case at RHIC, you're still not recovering this energy. That's the same as what you saw at like the LHC, where you have to go to very wide angle, pretty much to the entire hemisphere in order to recover the lost energy. So this comparison between narrow and wide jets, I think that sort of is the future of these substructure measurements, and they help us identify different types of energy loss in the medium. Okay, so I kind of lied in the beginning. I said there are 4 topics. There's actually 5. So we're going to take a very, very short detour and talk about, what is the usefulness of these machine learning tools that people are kind of starting to look at. Hannah's spent a lot of time making a wonderful measurement, pushing it down, pushing the spectra of jets down to lower PT, which is where all the key physics, all the fun physics is happening, if you ask me. So machine learning is a broad subfield, right? I'm not going to describe everything that's done. I'm going to selectively highlight works that I've been involved in over the past couple of years. So one thing that we looked at, is using convolutional neural networks that look at just the image of the jet, something like what you see on the right side here. So on the top, you have, gluon jets. The bottom, you have quark jets. So just by looking at kind of the weighted distribution, just by looking at the color scheme, you can kind of already tell that gluon jets are a little bit broader, right? So these are quenched jets, coming from Pythia, and then you put it inside Joule, and Joule does the jet quenching for you. So then what we asked the question, Yang-Ting and I, is can a model actually identify quenched jets from unquenched jets, right? And this is kind of a very, it's kind of a very interesting question. It's not asking, can you identify quark or gluon jets? It's asking, can you identify jets that have quenched behavior as opposed to, vacuum-like emission? And you can actually see the best performance here. So you have to be in the bottom right-hand side to have the best performance. And you can see the blue curve, is the one that's able to distinguish the most a quenched jet versus an unquenched jet. And the blue curve comes from a deep convolutional neural network. All the other curves, they're doing a relatively good job, but they are still observables that we put in by hand, right? You have the physics variables, you have telescoping deconstruction, which is kind of a hybrid model. I can talk about that in a little bit more detail if you want. But these convolutional neural network actually seeing something in this, and this can actually be used, for example, in very peripheral gold events, or in like high multiplicity PP events or high multiplicity proton gold events, where you can say, okay, do I have quench-like structure inside my jet population? And this, is one example of something that can be useful if you want to ask that kind of a question. So the other area where substructure actually, is used, because this, is actually a machine interpretation of the substructure inside your jet. So we can also use substructure to kind of identify different types of jets. So this is work I know that some people like Helen, have had looked at before, identify kind of heavy flavor jets at like RHIC energies where the cross section, like I said, is very steep, right? So probability to find heavy flavor jet compared to light jet is very different than, for example, at the LHC, where you can trigger, on a TT bar sample, you can enhance your statistics, you can play all those games, but you can't do that at RHIC. So you really need a machine learning algorithm that can give you high efficiency and high purity. And that's actually what we have shown in our recent work. This is done by Georgi Ponimakin. He's a master's student at Prague. And he came here and worked with us for a couple of weeks last summer. And he came up with this kind of model that's already used in literature, but adapted it to our purpose. So we looked at jets and its constituents as part of this descriptors, right? So you basically take a jet, all of its constituent, put that into vectors of kind of information. So you have PT, eta, phi, dCA, Z, the delta R, put all of those, and it combines it into a latent vector, which is a multi-dimensional latent vector that can describe specific classes of jets. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the model, but what we find is that if you just look at the efficiency versus purity, so figure on the right, you have at 80% efficiency, you have 80% pure, above 80% purity as a function of jet PT. Now, this is the most high performing heavy flavor tagger so far. You can run this at the LHC, and we have compared it. It performs better than what Atlas is using and what CMS is using. On the right, because this is an important point here, to also look at background rejection, what this gives you at an efficiency of roughly 50%, is a background rejection that is roughly the same as the cross-section difference between heavy flavor jets and light jets. So what this network does, actually, it negates the effect of the cross-section, and it gives you a sample of heavy flavor jets that you can then, with high purity and high efficiency, make your measurements. Okay, so that was relatively short detour. So in the last couple of minutes that I have, I want to talk about something moving forward, right? So something that I find to be very exciting and very cool is actually measuring the parton shower. So we don't have to stop at kind of the first splitting, right? We can kind of extract this. We can say, okay, first one, second one, third one, go along the shower and make a figure, something like this, where I have the splitting, first split, second split, third split, and moving along the shower, I can kind of see this gradual breakdown, and this tells me what is the AP function as it evolves inside your jet. That's a little bit of a jump, but let's see how we can get there, right? My goal would be to make some kind of TMD plot that they have, that you see these ESC folks like to show. It's kind of evolution. It would be so cool if we can do that here. These splittings also give you access to the formation time, right? Because it's a kind of an obvious statement, but the second one happened after the first one, happened after the third one. So you have kind of a time ordering here. So you can compare these for a given split. So there is a little bit of interesting work that you have to do in order to correct for detector effects, because your hierarchy, the 1, 2, 3, can actually change in the detector, right? You can lose one, and what you call first split now at the detector is actually the second split at the particle level. So there's all sorts of funny contribution going on that you don't have to deal with if you're only looking at the first split. If you're looking at second and third, you have to correct for the detector effects on the hierarchy, and then correct for whatever unfolding that you have. So we actually do it the unfolding, and then we correct for the hierarchy effect. So, and this being a kind of a talk, I can give you a sneak preview of what these results are going to look like. So this is work that we've been doing for a few months now, and it's going to go sort of straight to publication. I have the first, second, and third splits. So it's not fully unfolded, but it's not done. It's not corrected for the jet finding and the split finding efficiency. That's a little bit of a small correction factor that then further enables us to compare kind of to calculations that exist at or very close to lambda QCD. So there you can actually see these splittings as you go along the jet. The second and third splitting, you see this breakdown of your 1/z shape. And as you go to higher initiated PT, you can see that you're kind of going back up. So this is now showing you time-dependent phenomena within a shower, right? So the breakdown is happening inside your jet shower. So this is very cool according to me, but it's still plagued by hadronization corrections, right? So for example, if I show you this is the first split, second split in Pythia, this is without hadronization. These are the shapes, right? And I have different parton showers in Pythia. You can see there's some difference between them, right? I turn on hadronization, poof, all the difference is gone, right? So we have essentially made a measurement based on a particular algorithm. How can we connect it to the parton shower, right? That's where I think we have to come up with an observable that correlates your partonic splittings that you have from the shower to the hadronization stage that you can recover with your whatever algorithm. So just a couple minutes, what we done in the workshop last year, and the report is in progress, is we looked at the parton shower, the hardest KT split on the y-axis correlated to the Gluon split that we get from your soft drop. You see that, you know, at relatively, you know, high PT kinematics, these are 30 GeV jets, you actually do have a nice diagonal correlation. So this is essentially the first observable that, in a sense, correlates to a parton shower quantity in this case. So there are also things that we can do, you know, taking this forward, you know, pun intended, in the case of star forward, kind of use this as a tagger, like I said already before. We can isolate the initial parton and, you know, kind of the small system style collisions, look at fluctuating proton size if you have access on jets that are ending up in your forward region. There's also some kind of interesting physics that one can study in kind of mid-peripheral, where you can have significant energy loss, but you have less underlying event. You know, once you tag something in the forward, you can then study like the rapidity dependence, etc. So this one is just kind of a, you know, just like a list of like what things I think are very, very interesting to look at. Also UPC dijets, if it's possible. So that brings me to like the end of my talk. I'm not going to go through this, but these are kind of three main highlights that I've talked about today. So thank you. Hope it was not too fast.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the wonderful talk. So let's go to some questions. Who would like to start?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So thanks, Raghav. Really nice talk. Can you go back to slide 50?
Oh, I clicked that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, hereabouts, I guess. So when you talk about like first split, second split, third split, I mean, ZG is a fraction of. So if I have a 20 GeV parton, do I see the exact same splitting function for it if that 20 GeV is the first split? Or if I go to the second split and I say, as long as I know it's 20 GeV, is it exactly the same? Or if I go to the third split and the 20 GeV has the same? I mean,
that's exactly that is exactly the question that I'm trying to answer in this measurement, right? These are splits at the corresponding initiator PT. So they are the same initiator, the prong that initiates the split have the same PT, right? So if we just take the middle one, right? So like 20 to 25 GeV. Where the split exists, whether it sits in the first splitting or it sits in the second splitting or the third, the ZG looks different, right? This is because you're now constraining the available phase space for your radiation. So you don't have the same, you know, integration in your dGlap function, if you will, because, you know, you have 1 over theta d theta, you have 1 over omega d omega, right? And when you integrate between the limits, you cannot go as wide as you can. You have a cutoff based on the previous splitting, right? Because the assumption is that these are, you know, angular ordered, and I think that's a reasonable assumption to make. But, you know, that kind of constricting of phase space breaks down your shape of ZG as you move along the shower.
Okay, beautiful. That answers my question. Thanks.
This is Tom speaking. Also following up on slide 50, so the exact one. On your 15 to 20 and 22 to 25 GeV panels, you both of them had like the first, second, and third splitting. Is there any particular reason why on the 25 to 30 GeV subplot you somehow don't measure the third splitting? Like any reason is not so significant?
I mean, that's a good question. The reason is just that if you have an initiator of like 25 GeV at the third splitting, right? Just go back to the jet PT, right? So the second split, the Z is roughly, you know, you just look at the distribution, right? The second split Z is faster, so the mean is roughly 0.2. So you add some energy to that. So the second split is 30 GeV roughly, and then you go back to the first split, then you grooming. So you're roughly talking about 35, 40 GeV jets, and to like end up with the third split of that, you need a lot more statistics. So the reason it's not here is purely because the uncertainty is based on the statistical and the systematic blow up.
Okay. So when I need a third splitting at say PT equals 25 to 30, then we have like 40 GeV jet which don't have statistics. Okay, thanks. Great, that makes sense. Thank you.
Anyone else for the next question?
Hey, Raghav. I'll ask the canonical machine learning question about, in identifying quenched structures, what are the main features in your machine learning?
So the main features in this is actually the extraction of the kind of width of the jet, right? So it's looking at, so you basically start from a convolutional network. In order to get it down to a projection, we have to do what's known as max pooling, right? So you basically create a smaller subsample and you kind of scan it. So it's identifying regions inside your jet where you have large energy spread. So that's my intuitive understanding on this. But what can be done is actually look at this in a more quantitative fashion by kind of exploring what is the feature space at each step of the prediction. So that is that's a good question, because you want these models to like tell you something useful, right? Like, can we actually learn a feature of quenched jets that are different than unquenched jets?
Yeah.
And this is actually telling you that even though you're looking at gluon-like jets in PP, you can still identify quenched gluon jets as opposed to a regular gluon shower.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be interesting to see your feature list and the weights. I mean, I don't know that you did this. I guess you're on the paper, so you must have weighed.
Well, I mean, you're talking about the input features?
Yeah, I mean, what features does the machine learning way to give you the best result?
Yeah, so it's not really the input features, right? It's kind of higher dimensional features that are built during the training, right? The input features is just that jet image. That's all. It's just a 2D representation of a jet along with some kind of, we did this for jets at like the LHC, so using CMS kinematics. So we basically gave it a jet image and we said, okay, here's PP jet image, here's quenched jet image. Can you actually identify one from the other? And turns out you can do it very, very well.
But what does the image consist of? I mean, you're talking about particles with all their momenta and energies?
Yeah, it's just a 2D plot of PT and a corresponding eta phi. That's it.
It's a 2D plot, okay.
Yeah.
I guess I should look up your paper. Thank you.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up question on what John was talking about. So you said that it worked pretty well, but that's just for gluon jets, right? Like, because quark jets, you don't really have as much to go off of. There might be a better word.
No. So, I mean, I showed you one plot because, I mean, I had to squeeze this into the talk. You look at the paper, we also show this for quark jets, and actually it can distinguish quenched quark jets better than, the distinction between identifying quark and gluon jets, right? That gets worse if you include quenching. That's for sure, because your quenched quark jets masquerade as gluon jets, right? But whether you can identify the extent of quenching, right? That's what this kind of problem tries to look at identifying vacuum-like jets versus quenched jets, because you can have jets that only undergo vacuum-like radiation, inside your medium. So there's this kind of work by Paul Kokal and Edmund Iñárritu that looks at the kind of splitting space. So by looking at just the particle spread in your jet, right, this convolutional neural network essentially telling you that it can distinguish quenched gluon jets better than it can distinguish quenched quark jets, right? I mean, this comes from the assumption of medium response inside Joule. So this is, of course, a model-dependent statement, right? Doing this across different models and across types of jets identified by using the kind of topic modeling that Jasmine and others are kind of working on. That will be sort of the next step.
Okay, thanks.
Is anyone else having a question? I think with the time, we for sure have still time for 1 or 2 more questions.
I see Tom has his hand up, but I think that's probably from the earlier one.
Yeah. I already asked my question.
Okay.
So let me ask a question myself. A bit broader scope. So what is actually your personal take on jet quenching in small systems like PLED, related also to a possible QGP droplet in small systems? What is your, let's say, opinion on this?
Yeah, so this is a question that, in a professional seminar setting, I'll give one answer, and then in a, friendly, informal setting, I might give, a little bit of different answer. But so my opinion on what we see is, we haven't studied all that we can study yet in these small systems, right? So high multiplicity PP collisions are something that is very it's very interesting to me, whether you can see some kind of modification, but quantifying this high multiplicity or quantifying these style of events have to be different than the phase space in which you're reconstructing jets, right? So you cannot look at high track multiplicity events and then tell me that, hey, Jet-SubStructure looks different. Of course it'll look different because you're correlating the observable with the classifier, right? I mean, you just cannot do that. So if you can have a way of identifying, using what like David did by looking at, the forward, or even that turns out to have some kind of funny correlation. But yeah, I don't think there's, we have closed the chapter on that there's either no QGP or there's droplet of QGP. As far as jets are concerned, they don't seem to show any modification. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So that's a very muddled answer. I don't know if I can give you a very direct opinion more than that.
Oh, it's fine. Excellent.
Yeah, I mean, I would be curious to see what these high multiplicity events are. Like, how many jets are there? Is it just some funny, case where you had multiple hot scatterings, or you had, you just have lots of jetty events, and that somehow turns out to give you long-range correlations? I don't know. It's a little bit of a hard thing to comment on, given we don't have a lot of data, this kind of jetty data in those systems yet. But it is certainly a very interesting aspect.